Hi, everyone. You're all very welcome to this Doctoral College webinar. And today's event is called the Viva Voce, what to expect. So what we're looking at here is the examination of your thesis and what that should and will entail. So what I've tried to do here is to gather a number of slides together in this presentation, and just to give you some advice, some tips, some guidance about what it is that you can expect to find in the Viva Voce itself. In some of these instances, these things, there may be things that I've included here which will not necessarily happen in everyone's Viva Voce, but I think it's always good to be well prepared in advance and to cover as many bases as possible. And I'll just give you a link then to one of the, I think, most brilliant people that I've seen in terms of working with PhDs. She has given her name's gone under my head. I think it's Almina Yunus, and she has developed a whole suite of videos and links to give people advice on what to do with regard to the PhD and so much else besides. But she's brilliant on the Viva itself, and she did a particular study guide, and I'm just going to show you some of the links involved in that also. So we'll go through what we have here, and then at the end, as I say, we'll have a plenary discussion about this topic. So I'm just going to give you just an outline, first of all, of what it is we're looking at in today's webinar. So we're just going to talk about the purpose of the exam, preparation, possible questions that can arise, the examiners, the role thereof of the internal and external examiners, the examination process itself and what's involved in that, and just the outcomes, because there's here at UL there are 6 different outcomes which are possible, and a checklist, if you like, of just what you could do in advance of the examination itself. And we're also looking just at just a quick synopsis of the top tips that are involved. So with regard to the first one, the purpose of the examination, what we're looking at there are, I would say, and not everyone may agree with this, but I would say that there are 3 critical functions involved in the Viva Voce. And when we're talking about the Viva Voce, we're talking about the thesis defence as it is in Ireland. It has a Viva Voce could be very different, for example, in countries such as Sweden and France and Spain and the Netherlands and the USA. But here in Ireland, it is basically, it's an examination involving an internal examiner who'll be a member of faculty here in the university, and an external examiner from who's from an outside university. And there'll be a chair also on the day, and your supervisor could also be in the room. But it's a thorough examination of your written work, and indeed in some jurisdictions, like I've seen in Australia, where there in many universities, in fact, I think perhaps still in the majority of universities, where there isn't an oral defence, but there is here. So. For anybody who might be looking at this from outside Ireland, they might find it a little bit strange to think that there are, these that the examination itself involves a thorough examination of your work. So the purpose of that, though, the purpose of the Viva, I would say, is 3 particular crucial elements to that. First of all, it's to check, and this might seem in a way a little bit absurd, but they have to check that it's your own work, which might seem, as I say, a little bit unsettling. But one of the reasons why this has to, you can relate how your contribution is different, and that's really important the way you can distinguish yourself from others in the field. And we can talk more about that as we go on. So just in terms of preparing for the Viva, just have a number of points here which you might find useful. It's always good, when you've submitted the softbound copy, what we call the copy of your thesis for examination. It's always good to take a break from your thesis for a while and to give your head some peace in that regard. But say about 10 days, maybe 10 or 11 days in advance of the Viva Voce, it's always good to reread your thesis. And I'll just outline later a kind of a 10-day plan for what to do in advance of the Viva Voce itself. But in terms of preparing for the Viva, I would say it's really important that you reread the thesis and to identify what the highlights are. What are the parts of the thesis that you think are really strong. It can be useful. You don't have to necessarily do this, but it's good, I would say, to summarize each chapter. Think perhaps of what your key arguments are. Think of like the key works that you've cited, and maybe identify what those key works are. So anything that you've cited, maybe more than 5 times in the thesis itself. It's always good to say, what have I mentioned in the thesis, about the gap in the literature, or important data that you have, inferred from or used or contested against or added to in your thesis. So think about the key works that you have used in your thesis, and think about the rationale also for each chapter. Why did you do what was the rationale for this particular chapter, and why was it that you did it? These are always good to think about in advance. As I say, it may not be the case that you're necessarily asked about. It's unlikely you'll be asked. Well, sometimes you can be asked, what's the rationale behind this chapter? But it's just always good, as I say, to have it thought about in advance, because that can also just help you to allay or to diminish, just any kinds of feeling of fear or nervousness that you have on the day of the Viva itself. And think about then, how you're going to defend your thesis. So think about, say, and the examiners will ask you, about your research methods or your research question, your methodology. So they'll ask, why this research question? Why was it that you decided to follow this particular route or this particular pathway in your thesis? Or why did you choose these particular methods or this particular methodology? So it's always good to have thought about this in advance. As I said, almost as a form of reassurance, but it's almost inevitable that you will be asked about your methods, your methodology, and also your research question. And it's also good, and again, this may not be something which you will be asked about, but it's always good to try and review, think about if you have notes from just in fact, if you have it embedded in your memory about, times that you worked with your supervisor and you thought about, what were the key turning points in your thesis? What were, when did you make the kind of breakthroughs or the findings, or, you came across a piece of data that was, really, really exciting and that helped you to think about your thesis in a different way. So try and identify, what the key turning points were in your thesis. And it's always really good to try and do a mock Viva. And your supervisor can be really good for this. I have to say, I did a mock Viva with my supervisor a few days before my defense, before my Viva Voce. So I did a mock, and it put the fear of almighty whatever into me. So it's not always good. Well, no, but it was very, very useful. It was really useful because, in fact, and it was interesting because my supervisor asked me quite a number of questions in that Viva, in that mock Viva, that I hadn't necessarily thought about. And some of them, well, I'd say maybe one of those questions then, one or two of those questions came up in the Viva itself. But by actually having asked me some of these questions, it actually helped me once I got through all the fear and came out the other side of that. I thought, okay, at least now I'm going into the Viva, you know, really well prepared. So it's always good to do a mock Viva. I think the question that really threw me in the mock Viva was that where do you situate yourself in the field? And I thought, oh my God, like that's I couldn't really figure that one out, you know. But by the time it came to the Viva itself, a few days later, I was able to say, yes, I can position myself in the field, you know, here. But it was something that I found really difficult to answer beforehand. So a mock Viva, I think, would be really good, really useful. You may find it even more. You might even find the mock Viva tougher than the real Viva itself. But it's always good to practice in advance, because one of the things you're doing in a Viva is that it's also something which is not discussed, but it's also a public speaking exercise. So it's always good to have practiced these things and to have practiced these things out loud, because a lot of the things that we think in our heads, we don't articulate them by voice in the same way a lot of the time. So a lot of the time, you know, we have, you know, perhaps a lot of muddled thoughts in our head, and we can articulate things really well, or it can be vice versa. You know, lots of brilliant thoughts, but unable to articulate them. But it's really important, I think, that you're able to, you know, to speak clearly about these things, because if you're confusing, and that's why I'd say the mock Viva is really good, because if you are, if you find that what's coming out is confusing you, it can, or confusing the people who are, you know, listening to you in the mock Viva, you have some time to remedy that and to get your thoughts crystallized and clear, and to get, you know, what you're going to say ready for the Viva itself. So it's really, really good to do this in advance. You know, as I say, it may scare the life out of you, but you'll find afterwards it's something that you really, really benefit from. Okay, and it's always good to discuss your research with others, you know, discuss it with friends, with peers, with faculty members, etc. Because it just helps you just to think about it and to articulate it. And as I say, the Viva is a public speaking exercise, and it's important that you speak as much about your Viva as possible in advance. Okay, so I would say the questions, a lot of the questions would come under, and again, not everybody may agree with this, but may come under like four primary headings. What's your thesis about? What did you do? What did you find out? And why does it matter? You know, the so what question. Sometimes you can be asked this, you know, why was it important that this was done? What's your contribution? What's the gap in the knowledge? You know, why does this matter? And sometimes, you know, you can be thrown by that question, but it's not, I don't mean necessarily that you'll be asked, why does your thesis matter, or why do you think it's important? But I think it's important also that you convey the passion for your for your PhD as well, for your thesis, and for the area in which you are, in which you've been so embedded for so long. Okay, so just these could be useful just as questions to ask yourself in advance, and you know, it's always good to think about, you know, why did you choose this topic? And if you were to start again, how might you approach it differently? You know, as I say, it may not be the case that the examiners will ask you that, but some examiners do ask that. So it's good to be covered and to think, well, at least if I'm asked this question, I'll be able to give, you know, an effective answer. Think about also what's your main argument, and can you summarize the thesis? I remember my first question was in the Viva was, can you summarize your thesis can you give us a short summary of the thesis? And then, you know, I was asked, well, what's your main argument? And I was asked all these questions. Why did you choose this topic? What would you do differently? Yeah, and I remember also being asked this question: how did you arrive at your research questions? You know, what was it? What kind of process was involved in arriving at those particular research questions? And again, you know, it's just worth thinking of these of this in advance. You know, it's not necessarily that you'll be asked, well, what are the strengths and weaknesses of your thesis, but it would be good for you to identify what areas you're really strong in and where the potential weaknesses are, because where the potential weaknesses are the places where the examiners are likely to focus on in the Viva itself. So just think about where you think it may be weaker than in other parts, and think about, how would you defend what you did in those areas that you've identified as weaknesses of your thesis. It's also good to consider, what are the limits of your thesis, because every thesis has limits. You're limited by time. You only have a certain number of years in which to do the thesis. You're also limited by the fact that, it's a project that so many of you are working on, on your own or just with a supervisor. You're limited by by a great number of things. You're at the start of your careers. You're also, limited by finances. You have other pressures in terms of, having to do other kinds of work while doing the thesis. So nobody is expecting that your thesis is going to be, the most perfect work of research in the area that was ever written. But, it has to be obviously of very, very high quality. But, there will be limits to every PhD thesis, no matter how brilliant those theses are. Yeah, and again, just think about, your methodology. How did you choose the design of your research? Again, these are just questions to ask yourself, and they are also, as I say, a form of reassurance in advance of the Viva itself. And it's also good to think about, how did your thesis change along the way? Because it's, it's almost inevitable that at some stage your thesis would have changed from what you began with. If you look back to your initial stages and your proposal stage, it's very likely, I would say, that your thesis did change somewhat along the way from that initial conception that you had about it. And again, this is the question I was asked in the mock Viva, and I said, put the absolute frighteners on me. Where would you place yourself in the field, and who are the other key players? And again, it's just, I thought, well, at least now when I was going into the Viva, I had this question, I would be able to answer this question. But it was the question, as I said, in the mock Viva that really threw me. Okay, so just things to remember, when you're going into the Viva. So it's an opportunity, first of all, to explain your research. So, you should view it also as an opportunity. As I said, in the overwhelming majority of cases, people who have got to this stage, if you have got to 4 years of a PhD, I won't say it's guaranteed, because I can never say it's guaranteed, but you have a great chance then of succeeding. If you were doing the odds for what your chances are, or the chances of PhD, somebody who's got to the 4th year of a PhD, you have to think of it that you've gotten this far, you've gotten through all the progression panels. Your supervisor or supervisors have signed off that you are ready to submit. So it should be the case that if you can do an effective defense, with everything else in place, that you've a great chance of getting through the Viva and having a happy outcome. So I just want to say, that it's an opportunity to explain your research, and I say to celebrate your research also. And by the time you get to the Viva stage, it's you who should be the leading expert on the topic. When you begin with your supervisor or supervisory team, it's quite likely that one of them, the lead supervisor, will be the expert in the area. But over time, that relationship, it's almost inevitable that changes, and that it's somewhat overturned, that you, by the end, are the leading expert in the topic. It's also important to remember that the examiners want you to do well. Nobody, when they are asked, I've never heard of an examiner when they were asked to be, an internal or an external examiner on a thesis. I never heard anyone say, I'm going to go on, I'm going to get the, I'm going to make sure that the next Viva I examine is going to fail. Nobody wants you. They're not willing you to do badly. They want you to do well. They want you, they want this to be ultimately a celebration of your research. But that very much depends, on what you have submitted. But if you have submitted, a thesis that they believe is of sufficient quality and of sufficient rigor, it's almost, it's, unless they are quite malevolent, they will want you to do well. Your thesis, as I said, will never feel finished. That's why it can be so difficult for people to hand over their thesis, because as we talked about in the imposter syndrome webinar, so many PhD researchers are perfectionists and will never feel that the thesis is finished adequately. Everyone, I would say, along the way encounters some issues with regard to the thesis itself. This is just, it's, certain that you will have issues, be it, to do with your research. There'll be times when it's very demoralizing, when you will feel like, the results that you're getting just are that you're going nowhere with the research. This happens to everyone, and it's your ability to come back from those difficulties that really tests you. But that's why I always say that persistence is one of the greatest characteristics of any PhD researcher. Okay, we'll just look now at what happens, just on the day itself. So on the day, it's always good to have a copy of your thesis with you and to highlight or to bookmark certain sections that you think, could be raised, or if you've identified, say, your strengths and your weaknesses, just have those identified. You can make a presentation. Some faculties will insist on a presentation, but others not. You can ask if you can make a presentation. It may help you to relax and to ease your way into the examination itself. And obviously, just make sure that if water isn't supplied, that you have some on hand, because you will get very thirsty while you're speaking. You don't need to take notes necessarily. The examiners will give you a copy afterwards of the thesis itself, and this should be annotated. And it's also important to remember, that while you can't really appeal the result of the Viva, you can appeal the process, or if you feel that you weren't fairly treated in the Viva itself, you could appeal that. Just about the examiners themselves. So here in UL, you'll always have a chair of a Viva. This is somebody who's impartial. They're going to ensure that you get fair treatment, that you're not harassed or bullied at any stage of the Viva. You'll have an external examiner and an internal examiner, and their roles can be, a little bit different. We always say, officially that there's equal weight to the external examiner's opinion and the internal examiner's. But really, I think in practice, more weight tends to be given to the opinion of the external examiner, because they tend to be, not always, but they tend to be, the expert in the field. They tend to be more expert, but not always. But certainly, if in the Vivas that I've seen, there tends to be more deference given to the opinion of the external examiner than to the intern. Okay, so, and it's also important to remember, that everyone's Viva is likely to be a bit different, because examiners, they all have different styles of asking, of asking questions, different levels of experience and personalities. So you may feel, it's at some points, you may feel that a challenge has been made in a confrontational way in a Viva. But while this may seem like aggressive, sometimes it's not intended as such, or it's not something or it's sometimes it can be something, you know, that we can take personally when it's not intended in that way. So this is where the role of the chair is important, and the chair will intervene if they feel that you're not getting fair treatment. And I think you'll find that a lot of, you know, experienced examiners, they won't be, you know, they won't be confrontational. Some may be, you know, but as I say, don't take offense. It's not meant personally. It's about your work. So it's not, you know, some clash of personalities between you and the examiner. Okay. Usually what you have, you know, if you feel that the examiner is being somewhat aggressive, it's always good never to rise and take that bait. To be, you know, to be calm, that can be difficult though. But just because that can help, you know, to rebalance the discussion. But again, that would be only in extreme cases and quite unlikely. And that's where the chair should intervene and say, we need to change the tone of the questions, you know, and to be more, you know, to be fairer to the to the candidate. That's why, you know, an independent chair was really important, and we found that, you know, in UL, in some institutions, in a lot of institutions, for example, in the UK, you would just have the internal and external examiner in the room with the candidate and perhaps the supervisor as well, and you wouldn't have an independent chair. And I feel that's wrong. I feel that, you know, it's not fair on the candidate. So, okay, as I said, strengths and weaknesses. Make sure you can discuss both, and even when you've identified weaknesses in the thesis, that's a really good opportunity for you to be able to express how good you are at critical appraisal, because that will show the examiners, okay, the candidate here has identified weaknesses within the thesis, or we have identified a weakness, but the candidate has explained that weakness, you know, why there is this perceived weakness within the thesis, and they've shown that they're well able to, you know, defend why they did it this way, and, you know, that there were certain limitations to this particular element of the thesis. So that's why it's really good, you know, that, you know, to consider the weaknesses, where the perceived weaknesses that you may think your thesis has, and then, you know, be ready to defend those when you're in the examination itself. You know, and the examiners, you know, they're going to find a weakness in, no matter how brilliant your thesis is, they're going to find what they might consider a weakness, or something that they might say, well, okay, it's a great thesis, but just this this element of it here, we would just like you to clarify something about that. So they may just ask for clarification, or just a better explanation or better articulation of the argument that you've made. But it's always good to identify where you think a potential weakness is in your thesis. And, you know, don't accept or don't interpret, you know, kind of criticism of the thesis necessarily. That doesn't mean you're going to fail. I've come across instances, and this happened actually to somebody in the UK, somebody I know well, who said they had a really difficult Viva. Again, this was in a situation where there was only an internal and external examiner. There was no independent chair, which you'll always have here at UL. And they thought that this was going to be a disaster because they found the tone of the examiners very aggressive. But at the end, the examiner said, no, it was a great thesis. We just wanted to make sure, you know, that the examination was as rigorous as the thesis is good, you know, which was very peculiar way of looking at things, I thought. But this person found it, you know, quite traumatic. But and she was certain throughout the thesis, you know, throughout the examination, that it was going to, you know, that this was going to lead to a terrible outcome for her. But at the end, they said, no, it's a great thesis. Just we you know, and gave you a hard time because we wanted to test, you know, that you could defend it in a way that is, you know, commensurate with the quality of the thesis itself. So really awful experience for the person. But again, that is where the role of the chair is so important, and there was no independent chairperson in that examination. Okay, this is, as I say, just possible opening questions that you'll get on the day itself. Can you summarize your thesis in a sentence? You know, they may say in a few sentences. Why did you choose this topic? What did you intend to achieve at the outset of the thesis? What's your contribution to knowledge? And then think perhaps, you know, of your research design. How did you come to this structure? How did you, you know, choose to do it in this particular way? What other forms of research did you consider? Again, it may not be the case that you're asked this, and I don't remember being asked this in my Viva itself, but it's always good, just good to have this at least covered in your head as a form, as I say, of reassurance before you go into the thesis, in case you are asked these kinds of questions. How would you explain your research approach? And why did you select this particular design for your research? And another question that you may have, you know, it may be only one of you gets this kind of question. Can you explain where the data can be found and why your design is the most appropriate way of accessing that data? Again, you know, it's just, you know, I would say my only advice here would be just to, you know, consider that for your own thesis and think about, you know, where, you know, what was the most appropriate way of accessing that data. And it's just good to think about that in advance of the thesis itself. Now, with research methods, it's a certainty that you're going to be asked questions, you know, about your methods and your methodology. So you have to think about, you know, why did you choose these methods of collection? What other methods could you have considered or did you consider? And why did you, you know, why did you not include those? You may also be asked about what ethical issues you encountered, how well or how badly did the design of the thesis work when you tested it? And you could also be asked, you know, what problems did you encounter when collecting the data? You know, because it's almost inevitable, it's, you know, when you're collecting data, that there will be issues, there will be obstacles that are raised during that time. You will be also be asked, you know, about explain, well, almost, I can't say it's 100% certain, but think also about the difference between methods and methodology as well. That's always a good one to think about. So you may be asked, well, explain your methodology to us. How would you justify your choice of methodology? Why did you present in this form? So say, for example, if you presented in the form of a case study, you'd be asked, well, why this form and why not some other form? What choices of research approach did you consider as you planned your research? Again, you know, it's not by any means certain that you'll be asked this, but just to have this in the back of your mind and to have an answer ready if it's something that you are asked in the Viva itself. Again, just other question, why did you choose to investigate this topic? Describe how you approach the literature review. You know, again, you know, so many questions there that you can be asked about the literature, you know, and about how did you approach the gap in the literature and what your contribution to knowledge is, and how did you, you know, use the literature review to come up, say, with your research questions, or how did you use the literature to identify the gap in the knowledge that you are now seeking to address? So again, you know, yeah, I'll try not to be repetitive here. Why this approach and not other approaches? Yes, how did you select your, how did you access and select your methods for interviews? So if you conducted interviews, for example, these are all possible questions. And, you know, what's the, you know, main contribution? And if you were starting over, what would you do differently? Okay, so I'll just move on because a lot of this you'll have heard already. So possible questions with regard to your analysis and your findings. You may be asked, can you briefly describe your main findings? And you could then be asked, you know, again, not always, were the data collected the most suitable for answering your research question? You could also be asked, well, would you be able to talk further about your methods of analysis? What were those? Could you talk about those further? And you may also be asked, you know, what problems did you encounter when you were applying this method of analysis? So all of these things, you know, again, you know, not Not inevitable, but possible that you'll be asked these. Okay, now just go on to the outcomes that you would, and some almost finished here. So just the outcomes that we have here in UL. So 6 different outcomes. First of all is the degree of Doctor of Philosophy will be rewarded, without any changes to the thesis. This is a, wonderful, wonderful outcome, obviously. It's time to pop the champagne on the day, and it's fantastic. The most common outcome that we have here in the University of Limerick is outcome B, where it's deemed by the examiners that the candidate be awarded the Doctor of Philosophy, but it's subject to the correction of what are called minor errors, and you have 3 months to submit the corrections, and they will be assessed by the internal examiner. Another outcome that we see quite regularly is outcome C. Excuse me, that's where you will be, where it's deemed that you should be awarded you should be awarded a doctorate. However, you would be given 6 months to make amendments to the thesis. So it's a substantially more work than in, it can be a significant amount of work compared to outcome B. And you're given 6 months, and usually the corrections are for consideration by both the internal and the external examiners. So that's, a big difference between outcome A and outcome B. Outcome B and outcome C. So in B, the changes are only to be assessed by the internal examiner, and you're given 3 months, and they're minor errors. But in outcome C, there are some amendments. There may be substantial amendments that have to be made. You'll be given 6 months, and then those corrections or those changes will be assessed by both the internal and the external examiner. I'm almost loath to look at any other, because these are, these A, B, and C are the vast, overwhelming majority of outcomes here, thankfully, at the University of Limerick. But just in case, I'll just show you just what the others are, but hopefully you'll never have to contend with any of these. D is where where no degree is awarded, but you are continuing on the register. So that would mean like very significant changes are expected from you in the thesis. Outcome E is where the examiners deem that you not be awarded a doctorate, but that you be given a master's, a research master's, subject to making any amendments within 6 months of the Viva itself. And F is where no degree is awarded. But as I say, thankfully for the most part, for the vast, overwhelming majority of cases, outcomes A, B, and C are what we see here at the University of Limerick. Okay, how long does it usually take then for a Viva? Well, normally I would say it's at least 1 hour. I've rarely, if ever, heard of a Viva here, at least. That's, I don't think I've ever heard of one in UL that was over within an hour. So usually you'd expect it to be between 1 and 2 hours. And these figures are from, data that we have predominantly from the UK and Ireland. Sometimes less than an hour, but again, I've never heard of one in UL that was less than an hour. Between 2 and 3 hours, I'd say that's quite unusual, because then, it may be that there's some issues arising or some problems. It can happen for sure. And more than 3 hours, that would mean, that you'd be looking at, probably some substantial issues with the thesis itself. So, but usually I would say here in UL is between 1 and 2 hours. Okay, so I've just done up, I'm not going to go through each of these. This is just like a checklist. I'm going to send you on these slides afterwards. I'll send on the slides to everyone who registered for today's webinar. So you get these slides later today. So this is just a checklist, and this is just reiterating what I talked about already. This is just it in another format, and this is just like top tips that you get. So this will be, just some top tips that you can look at. I'll just put them up here if anybody just wants to, when they're looking at the recording of this, if they just want to freeze that for a moment or two, that's the first page of it. Just go on to the second page because I want to have time for discussion after this. But again, this is just reiterating what has been said already. So if somebody wants to just, freeze that for a second or two and just to take a snapshot or a screenshot of that, fair ahead, please feel free to do so. Just with your some references that we have here, there's a guide which we have in Doctoral College. It's a Viva Voce guide for UL doctoral candidates. Here, this link is a YouTube clip, which is just absolutely fantastic. And it's about 17, 18 minutes long. And it is quite brilliant. I'm so embarrassed. I can't remember or can't think of her name. I think it's Almina Yunus is her name. Yeah, Almina Yunus. She is really superb in terms of the advice that she gives to PhD candidates. As I say, it's about 17 or 18 minutes, that YouTube clip, and it's really, really well worth looking at. Because as I say, she just gives, really, really fantastic tips. I have a slide from her website just coming up in a second. These are also just, I think that's an article from The Guardian. Yes, Dr. Amina Yunus. Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, that's exactly who it is. And this is something from the Guardian newspaper, 17 top tips. This is just another article, what PhD examiners are looking for when they read the references in your thesis, when they're reading about the literature in your thesis. And this is just from Birmingham University, how to pass your Viva Voce, the 5 top tips. So I would just say, I'll just give you Dr. Amina Yunus next. This is, yes, that's her. That's it. So it's prepare for your PhD Viva in 10 days. And she gives this study schedule. And I'll send you all later, I'll send you all the link to what she has done on her website and on YouTube, because some of the resources she has are fantastic. Some are behind a paywall, but the ones that are free are also really, really good. But all her YouTube clips are free to view. But she is really fantastic in terms of the advice that she gives. And she did her PhD quite recently, so she speaks from from recent experience about the Viva process. And she did it in the UK. She said that there was just the internal and external examiner. There was no independent chair, so it would be different. In that way, it would be different from what we do here in Ireland. But she is well worth looking at, and that's a really good kind of schedule. It's a kind of a 10-day countdown into the Viva itself. But as I said, I'll send you all these links later for everyone who registered for this, and I might even try and put a link into the when we post this on YouTube later. So I'm going to stop recording now in a second, and I'll just say, as we say in Irish, good luck, or Ganari and Tholiv. And I'll just stop recording now. And then if you have any questions or comments or anything which you'd like to raise, then please do so in the remaining time that we have. So thank you all very much, and see you soon on one of these webinars. Take care. Thank you. Bye-bye. So great. Okay. So